In this section, we are going to take a look at how the Constitution of the United States was actually created. It's going to take some give and take. It's going to take a lot of compromise. After all, we have over 50 men from 12 different states coming together to try to figure out the best form of government. And this is what they came up with. The questions we're going to address: how did the delegates of the Constitutional Convention balance the competing interests of the states, large states, small states, northern states, southern states, with different types of economies, different types of agriculture, different types of interests? And what compromises needed to be made in order to get a government up, running, that could work and last for a lifetime? We'll take a look at a couple of key leaders. The first guy we want to talk about, George Washington from Virginia. We've already learned about him in the Revolutionary War. But when it came to the Constitutional Convention, he was the presiding officer. That means to say, he got to hold the little hammer and bang it on the table and tell people when it was their turn to talk. Now, George Washington did not participate much in the debates. He did not bring forth many new ideas. However, because he was George Washington, he lent a great deal of power and prestige to the meetings. As the people saw all these important individuals walk into Independence Hall in Philadelphia, they felt as long as George Washington was there looking out for our best interest, things were going to be all right. The real guy who made things happen was James Madison. That's why we consider him to be the father of the Constitution. James Madison oftentimes led the debates. Many of his ideas made it into the Constitution. In fact, when he showed up at the Constitutional Convention, he brought with him the Virginia Plan. This was an outline of government that established 3 independent, co-equal branches, where power was vested by the population as opposed to all states being equal. James Madison's core ideas made it into the Constitution, and that's why we consider him to be the father of the Constitution. We oftentimes talk about how James Madison took good notes. This was essential. At the time, the Constitutional Convention was closed to the public, and so there was no real written record of what was going on. Well, James Madison, as he was viewing what was going on, as he was listening to the proceedings, he would often take notes. He would take note of what people were wearing, what it smelled like, what the weather was like, and more importantly, what people said. And it's his notes that give us the best indication of what really happened behind those doors at Independence Hall. Later on, James Madison is going to put aside his differences with George Mason, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and he is going to author the Bill of Rights. And 10 out of the 12 proposals that he brought forth became the 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights. The Constitution begins, "We the people." This is a statement of what we would call popular sovereignty. That is to say, the power to govern in this country comes from the people. We also see in the Constitution that the power is going to be shared between the national government and the state governments. As we learned in our last segment, the Articles of Confederation was too weak. It gave too much power to the states. We wanted a stronger national government, yet not too strong. We didn't want to be like Great Britain, so we wanted to find the balance. And this creation of a federal system of government, where we would have a national government to take care of national concerns and a state government to take care of state concerns, became the best option. We also realize that our rights are protected. Later, after the signing and the ratification of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution, we get the Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights is what is going to guarantee, as Americans, our individual rights and liberties. And the Constitution offered a way to orderly change it. This is a pickup from the Articles of Confederation, which couldn't work. Here we are going to be allowed to change the Constitution. It's not going to be easy, but just in case we need to catch up to the times, as times always change, the framers of the Constitution felt putting in a system of orderly change would best guarantee the longevity of the Constitution of the United States. Some of the key issues and the resolutions that we had to solve. First of all, who's going to be more powerful, the national government or the state governments? Well, with federalism, we knew we had to balance that power. But exactly where is the line drawn? In the Constitution, we included the Supremacy Clause. And what that said was that the U.S. Constitution would be the supreme law of the land. But at the same time, states would have considerable powers to govern themselves. And as long as state laws complied with national laws, everything would be fine. So the U.S. Constitution is going to be the supreme law of the land. The Great Compromise was perhaps the most ingenious. Here we needed to balance the interests of the large states and the small states. I already mentioned the Virginia Plan, authored by James Madison. In his plan, he felt that the more populated states should have more power, more representation in the government. After all, this is going to be a government of all the people, not just the states. The smaller states took issue. And behind the New Jersey plan, they proposed all states being equal. Both sides came to a deadlock, calling each other names, talking bad about each other in public places, and finally, we stepped forward and realized a compromise can be made. We established what's called a bicameral, or two-house legislature. Here, we're going to have one house in Congress, the lower house, the House of Representatives, be based on population. So the greater the population, the more representation, the House of Representatives. But we will also have a Senate. And in the U.S. Senate, every state gets two, regardless of its size. And so therefore, by combining these two ideas, where all states are equal in the U.S. Senate, and states' power is based on population in the House of Representatives, this is known as the Great Compromise. We also had to figure out how slaves were to be counted in this new system for the purposes of taxation and representation in the House of Representatives. The southern states demanded that slaves be counted equally in the population. That would give them more power. But the northern states said no. Slaves don't deserve any count because they don't vote. Said some in the north, if you want to count them, let them vote. Well, controversy, climax, we get a compromise. We decided that for every 5 slaves in the population, it would count as 3 towards representation and taxation purposes. And this is going to placate, give in to some of the Southern demands so that we can make progress and move forward. Separation of powers is the basic cornerstone of the way the government works. In fact, all state governments at this time operate under separation of powers. Here we have the division of 3 branches of government. The legislative branch, which is our Congress, is going to make the laws. The executive branch, which is our president, is going to enforce the laws. And the judicial branch, which is the courts, is going to interpret the laws. What this means is by separating these powers, no one branch, no one area of the government has all the authority. If we combine too much authority in one place, that can lead to tyranny. And by separating these jobs out, by saying, hey, you're only allowed to do this, you're only allowed to do this, and you're only allowed to do this, that helps balance things out. And just to be sure, that nobody gets a little too excited and takes over a little bit too much, we are going to institute a system of checks and balances. In this type of system, checks and balances, the legislative branch is going to have certain powers over the executive branch. The executive branch is going to have certain powers over the judicial branch. The judicial branch will have certain powers over the executive and the legislative branch. And the legislative branch, you get the idea. We want to be sure that no one branch has too much power. Checks and balances. More specifically, take a law. Suppose Congress passes a law. That's their job. In order for the law to go into effect, it must be signed by the president. Checks and balances. But suppose the president doesn't like the law. He can veto that law and send it back to Congress. Checks and balances. But Congress, if they think it's a really good idea, can override that presidential veto and it becomes law anyway. Checks and balances. But the Supreme Court can take a look at that law, and if they decide that that law is unconstitutional, they can give it judicial review and revoke it as it violates the Constitution. As you can see, this forces the different branches to cooperate, but it also makes sure that no one branch is going to get too powerful. What they established in this room was a system of limited government. The Constitution limits the power of the federal or national government. It says, here's the rules. This is what you're allowed to do. You may not do any more than what's in your rule book. This is the extent of your powers. You are limited, and we have consented to give you this power. So the Constitution and the idea of limited government is designed to protect the people. And perhaps the most brilliant aspect of this entire document, as it was signed and sent out to the states and later ratified, was that the men in this room realized they were not perfect. That perhaps they might have made a mistake. Perhaps something was left out. Perhaps there's something they didn't think of. And that's why putting in a way to adjust to the changing times by adding amendments, the true brilliance of these guys stepped forward. That they wanted this document to last. They didn't want it to be so rigid that it would fall apart. And they didn't want it to be so loose that bad things could happen to the country. And by adding an amendment, our Constitution can change with the times. It is still in use today.